Hi, class. Continuing on with evolutionary evidence, the last bit on basically history or historical evolution is historical biogeographic evidence. So, biogeography is the study of where organisms are found now or fossils and things like that in the past, and what might past historical events had to do with that distribution. So, as you know, there is something called plate tectonics, where all the continents that we see today were not always in their same place. They're on these gigantic crustal oceanic plates, and the continents are actually lighter material floating on top, not exactly floating, but they move around, some as fast as a couple of centimeters a year, and over evolutionary time, hundreds of millions of years or many millions of years, they change location. So we're going to be looking at past locations where continents were and where they are today, and where certain organisms are found on them now and in the past. One of the things we'll look at is Australia, which is home basically to only marsupial mammals, and also the few number of existing monotremes, which are egg-laying mammals. And until humans showed up there 60,000 years ago, there were no placental mammals like we are. We give live birth, but marsupials, of course, are like possums or kangaroos. They have a pouch. They give birth to really underdeveloped young, but that crawl out of the birth canal, the vagina, and all the way up into a pouch and lock onto a nipple, and then develop further from there. Okay, and then we'll look at some whale stuff, but here we go. So, a couple of terms. Endemism means distribution that is found only in one location. It can be at many different scales. You can have certain species that are only found on certain islands, let's say, or in certain mountaintop ranges, or you can have endemic organisms that are found only in a certain continent. And Australia is a perfect example of that. There are all these marsupials that are only found in Australia and closely surrounding areas like New Guinea and islands around there. Another is rat-tailed birds on various continents. Each species is found on an old continent that was part of Gondwana land. And then oceanic islands are very well known for endemism, like all the birds on the Hawaiian Islands are all endemics, found nowhere else in the world. The same with Galapagos finches. Hawaii also has a bunch of different plants that are found nowhere else in the world. Crickets, fruit flies, all kinds of things. So, let's look at many different scales of endemism. Why are there only marsupials on Australia and virtually no placental mammals? Now, there are marsupials also elsewhere in South America, and then surrounding Australia, and one in North America that dispersed from South America over the land bridge. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Okay, so let's take a look at this timeline, this distribution. The Delphid morpha, which including monodels and Didelphis and Metharchus are, one of those is actually in North America, Didelphis virginiana, okay? But also South America has a lot of, besides placental mammals and some strange ones at that, also has many marsupials. Pauca tuberculata. Now, like Microbiortheria is actually found in the upper Andes, and around I guess Venezuela or something like that. But it's actually most closely related to Australian marsupials. So here we have Microdithelthia, and then all these are found in Australia or surrounding Australia, like New Guinea. Okay? Even though now at this point, or in terms of fossils, and now is only found in South America, up in the Andes. Okay? So we know this because we've got DNA, and we compare it, and we see that, in fact, Microbiortheria shares a lot more with Australian marsupials. Okay. Also, so this is actually a phylogeny. The stuff in blue So, in the blue, which includes Microbitheria, but let me just show this. These are all where you would expect them, all in the Americas. In fact, most in South America, in the blue. However, Microbitheria is actually, and is also in the Andes in South America. But it is actually most closely related to all the Australia and New Guinean and some islands in Indonesia and stuff. So, in terms of the actual phylogeny. And then, all these ones that are in this red, so here's some here also, some here. These are all in surrounding islands, which were actually all connected to Australia when sea levels were lower around the Miocene. So the Miocene happened about about 30 million years ago, until I think 7 million years ago, something like that. So there were times when sea level was much lower and animals could actually cross from, let's say, Australia proper to New Guinea and those islands around there. Okay? So I want you to make sure you understand that. And also, I want to show you something. So, at one time, a couple of 100 million years ago, 160 million years ago, something like that, this is Pangaea, where all these continents were all kind of stuck together. And eventually, things started to break up about, Gondwanaland is the southern bunch. And they started to break up about 90 million, the end Cretaceous, into the early Cenozoic, which is what we're in right now. And at that time, Africa, India, kind of, and Australia went off by themselves, and then South America and Antarctica were stuck together. But eventually, Australia, South America, and Antarctica were connected up to about, I think 35 million years ago. And it looks like, in fact, that marsupials, the earliest marsupials were in South America. One went up to North America, which we have today, the Virginia opossum. We have those around here. But then there was a migration from South America into Antarctica, which was at that time a temperate forest, not like it is today, and then across into Australia. And eventually those things then broke apart. So of course now we've got Australia here, got Africa and the Middle East, we've got Australia, and about right in through here. So all those have marsupials. Africa doesn't have marsupials. Oh, by the way, also there's India that also went along with Africa. So at this point, there are only marsupials here, one up here, just a single one, and then this area around here. And that's because in the very distant past, all those continents were all kind of together at various points. And when the earliest marsupials showed up about maybe 160 million years ago, South America and Australia were stuck together. And then later, North America connected. Okay. Now, one more thing. So, also, another example is, again, Pangaea. And this is when all these continents were, this is probably 200 and something million years ago. And all these little dots are fossils of fossil lungfish, except for one place where they're found today on Earth, and that is, I have to go here, I'll do a different color, this, right on the northeast coast of Australia. These lungfish are only found there that are living, actually living today. But the fossils, as you can see with the red dots, all over the place, right? All have fossil lungfish everywhere. And this is basically due to the fact that lungfish were extant in the Carboniferous 300 and something million years ago, okay, when all these continents were stuck together. Okay, so, and then you could read these. Why should we expect to find lungfish fossils all over the world, given that it first evolved in Pangaea? Well, all these different species of lungfish were found throughout Pangaea, all the different continents that have since moved because of plate tectonics. How might we use DNA sequence similarities together with biogeography for evidence for evolution? Well, you can see which species are more closely related to each other. exactly with DNA evidence, whereas with fossil evidence you only have morphology, which can be misleading. But at the same time, you can create kind of what's called a, uh, let's see, a biogeographical phylogeny, uh, mapping current distributions with DNA and fossil evidence onto various locations in the world today, and then explain that with how the continents have moved since then. Okay, so direct observation of evolutionary change. Now, one of the first things that Darwin, first of all, Darwin was part of the landed gentry, okay? So, and he was a breeder. He bred pigeons. Breeding pigeons back in his day in the 19th century was a big deal for wealthy landowners. And they bred a lot of things. They also bred dogs and cattle and sheep and different crops. So, and when humans do that, it's called artificial selection. Okay, so Darwin noticed that what artificial selection was, where humans actually using selective breeding, taking, let's say, plant pollen from one race of corn and pollinating another to get certain traits, or the same thing with dogs, having certain various breeding, trying to get a certain breed of dog new by combining two old ones. That you could use artificial selection. Okay, so for example, and we also know that wolves are the actual ancestors of modern domestic dogs. All the ones that we find today, it's not sure if it happened a number of times where the domestic dog, there might be a couple of different lineages from different wolf populations that were hanging out with humans 16,000 or 20,000 years ago. So artificial selection is actually like selective breeding. Biological evolution for desired traits caused by humans. Okay, selective breeding process by which humans determine which individuals with desired characteristics will mate and produce offspring with those characteristics. Now, natural selection versus artificial selection is very similar. It's just that instead of humans choosing the traits, the environment, in this case, selects for which individuals have which traits that help them survive and reproduce better than other individuals that don't have those traits. In future generations, of course, those that survive and breed will leave more offspring and more genes in future generations. So natural selection and artificial selection are very similar. It's just that humans do artificial selection for the traits that we want, and whether it's plant crops or animals that we breed for food or whatever, or natural selection in which the actual environment that organisms live in favor certain traits over others. Okay, so let's take a look. The common ancestor of all dogs, modern dogs, was the gray wolf. There might have been a number of different introductions, perhaps into North America or perhaps into China. We don't know yet. That's still up for debate. Or it might have been just one introduction, like it shows with this phylogeny, where the gray wolf gave rise. It was domesticated one time, and eventually that spread all over the Americas, Europe, China, India, and so forth. And then, in terms of, like in Europe, certain breeds were developed. European toy dogs, terriers, mastiffs. In North America, Native American dogs that Native Americans bred, or the Arctic Spitz. In China, there were these feral dogs, as well as the Chow and the Oriental toy dogs that were similar to those found in Europe. And then in India, sight hounds and scent hounds that were developed. And like the scent hounds eventually gave rise to gun dogs like pointers and spaniels, and sight hounds gave rise to Afghan hound and borzoi. The feral dogs gave rise to dingoes that made it into Southeast Asia, and then finally Australia, and Asian pariah dogs that kind of still live there, but they're really not owned by anything. And then in Europe, there are some Native American dogs still left around. And then from Europe, there was Great Dane, St. Bernard, Bulldog, Pug. These are all from Mastiffs, and there's still terriers from which, like the Bulldogs and things like that are from. Actually, I think Bulldogs are more closely related to terriers, and anyway. Okay. So this is what selective breeding has done. Now you can see that all these dogs, a lot of them are very different. First of all, there's a big difference in size. We've got very, very little small dogs, like pugs, European toy dogs. And Oriental toy dogs. We've got medium-sized dogs. Terriers, native dogs, perhaps these feral dogs, chows. And then we've got some very large dogs, mastiffs. And we already learned a little bit in genetics how you get different sized dogs in terms of different expression patterns. So these are kind of large. Okay. Before, they're all one species. Okay, they're called Domestica familiaris. Okay? So breeding of dogs gives an example of how you can actually get evolution by natural selection. And this was Darwin's second great idea, along with Wallace. So how does selective breeding lead to artificial selection? Over time, populations resulting from generations of selective breeding can significantly change, especially if they are whether consciously or unconsciously chosen, have certain traits by humans. Let's say fetching dogs that gave rise to retrievers and things like that. So, okay. So Darwin's second great idea was evolution by natural selection. Okay? And, of course, part of the idea, besides biogeography and things like that, came from his artificial breeding, his own experiments and others in England and Europe. And he saw how different races of, let's say, different dogs, he called them races, all those dogs that he called all the different groups, all the different breeds, races. And he saw how they're similar to species, but that perhaps species are more well defined. Okay. So natural selection, those individuals' particular traits, this is evolution by natural selection, that's very important. Evolution by natural selection. We'll see later on that you can have natural selection without evolution or evolution without natural selection. But in terms of getting adaptations, evolution by natural selection. So those individuals' particular traits that survive long enough to reproduce will pass on those traits to their offspring, who continue to reproduce and pass on the advantageous characteristics or traits. In other words, whoever has the most kids wins. Dead individuals do not pass on traits. And then an adaptation, or first of all, adaptation, where you become, a lineage becomes adapted to a certain environment by which a population becomes better matched to its environment over time through natural selection. And then an adaptation can also be a noun, namely a trait that helps it to either survive and or reproduce better than individuals that don't have that trait. Okay, so there's been a number of examples of natural selection in action that resulted in changes in this case, physical features, because of a response to a changing environment. So I've often talked to you about, let's say, wolves. If you go up near the Arctic, the wolves have very dense fur. It's cold up there, of course. But let's say it was to get colder. What would you expect to happen? You'd expect over time those individuals that already had dense fur to leave more offspring. They'd survive better in the colder and reproduce better. And those with thinner fur would die out. If, on the other hand, the environment went back and became warmer, like right now we're going through a period of global warming because of human-induced climate change, you would expect eventually that wolves, there's variation in fur density. There are going to be a few individuals that still have slightly thinner fur. They'll leave more offspring. They'll survive better. And eventually the whole population will end up being wolves with thinner fur, because the whole, the climate has actually all warmed up all over the world. Okay, so there's these Darwin finches, medium ground finch, that are found in Galapagos Islands off of Ecuador. You've probably heard about them. And there were some researchers, the Grants, Rosemary and what's his name? Someone Grant from the Midwest, and they went to the Galapagos and studied Darwin's finches, and they got a bunch of grad students to go with them. And they concentrated mainly on this one island, very small island called Daphne Major. And there's this medium ground finch that's there. You can see what they look like. And the area, it's on the equator, but it actually changes. Some years are much drier than others. Occasionally there's a real serious drought that really affects all the organisms on those islands, including plants that produce seeds. So when there's lots of rain, you have great variation in seed size and seed hardness. But during a drought, all the finches and other seed-eating animals eat all the easy seeds to eat. The only ones left over are really hard seeds. Big hard seeds that take a big beak to actually crack. In other words, there's strong selection that favors hard beaks. If you have not a large hard beak, so let's say these are very hard beaks, large and hard. They can crack the biggest seeds. These are smaller beaks. These are the ones that actually die out during the drought because there's no smaller seeds they can eat. Only these guys actually survive over the drought. And then when the rains came back, the whole population, the beaks of the birds had all increased in size in terms of how big they were, how deep they were, how wide they were, things like that. So in the span of just one generation, the average size of those beaks was visibly larger. One generation, of course, the second generation, there were hardly any finches left over. The population initially went from about 1,400 all the way down to about 120. So only a tenth of the population survived. So let's take a look. What is natural selection? Process by which individuals with genetic characteristics that are advantageous for a particular environment survive and reproduce at a higher rate than individuals that don't. Okay? Selection happens on all kinds of different organisms. For example, human beings in areas where malaria is endemic in Africa, some individuals had a mutation that allowed them to prevent the plasmodium from infecting the red blood cells. And that mutation was what actually called sickle cell disease. But if you have one copy of it plus normal hemoglobin, you are resistant to malaria. Whereas you have normal hemoglobin, you get malaria and you die. And if you have two copies, you die as well. Okay. So, compare and contrast artificial and natural selection. They are similar in that both occur in populations. So, by the way, selection acts on individuals. An individual either has a trait, let's say in this case up here, big beaks or small beaks. So that's selection acting on it, which ones survive, the ones with the big beaks, over a drought, and they reproduce. And then over time, the population is composed entirely of individuals all related to these large-beaked individuals. And these ones die out. When the rains came back, things actually shifted back to what they were. So populations evolve, individuals don't. The traits that individuals have are like, if you've ever played poker, you get cards, let's say 5-card draw. Once you get that hand, that's it. Those are the cards you have. And it has nothing to do with how well you really play poker. It's a matter of, do you have two of a kind, let's say 2 8s? Do you have 3 8s? That's it, better. 3 of a kind is better than 2 of a kind. Do you have a flush, all 5 cards, all of the same suit? Do you have a straight, like 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6? That's a low straight or a high straight. Do you have a full house, 3 of a kind and 2 of a kind? Do you have 4 of a kind? All that kind of stuff. Each is a better hand that I've gone through, right? That's what individuals are born with. Their hand does not change during their lifetime. If the traits that they have fit the environment that they're in, they are more successful, they survive longer, they reproduce more successfully, they leave more of their offspring and genes in the future generations, and those individuals that survive and breed make up all the individuals in the future populations, where individuals that don't survive, don't breed, and don't leave any offspring. Okay, so we'll go over that more. Okay, now there's lots of evidence of what's called microevolutionary change. So What's microevolutionary change? Changes in allele frequencies. We'll get more into this in a bit, but changes in allele frequencies in a population. And those alleles, remember we were talking about alleles like and genotypes. So let's say you have a genotype for black hair in dogs and brown, right? And you have three genotypes and black is dominant. So BB is big B, and big B, little b both have black fur, and then little b has brown fur. Okay, so not only has the phenotype changed, but the alleles and the number of alleles, proportions have changed in populations depending on what the environment is like. Okay, so evolution by natural selection changes allele frequencies in the DNA of organisms in response to their environment, and that oftentimes results in changes in phenotype as well. Okay, so we should be able to find examples of natural selection in nature. Okay, a change in traits, phenotype, or alleles of a population across generations. So individuals are selected either to live or die by the environment over time, and then eventually the populations that are made up of those individuals change in frequency depending on which individuals and then populations end up with the we'll call the higher fitness traits. Okay, so we've got a whole bunch of examples of this. We've got antibiotic resistance in bacteria. So, for example, diseases, usually antibiotic resistance, pesticides, insects and mites. When pesticides were first used, killed almost all the insects that it came in contact with. And then over time, insects with mutations, some individuals had mutations that allowed them to survive in the presence of a pesticide, like bacteria survive in the presence of antibiotics, and they become resistant to the antibiotics or the pesticide. And the same thing with herbicides. And then there was a study by a guy named Enders who did some stuff with guppies. They showed that guppy males, females like brightly colored guppies, but brightly colored guppies were detected visually by guppy predators in Eden. Okay, so we'll go over this, and then I'm going to want you to look at a video on antibiotic resistance. So we've got some bacteria, okay? These are going to be the individuals that natural selection is going to act on. Now, in this case, in the beginning, we have populations that are all clones of exactly the same bacteria with all the same alleles. They're identical to each other, like us having identical cells. Okay. Over bacteria reproduce very quickly. Say we produce every over time, there's reproduction, time T2, okay? Again, we see that, in fact, the wild type of bacteria, the white bacteria, have reproduced in greater numbers, right? The red have also reproduced. There's now 2 red and 2 blue from 1 red and 1 blue. And there's a new mutation that showed up as well in the yellow right here, right? So this is what happens over time. Mutations give rise to variation in the alleles that are present, in the genotypes that are present. Okay. Now, at, we'll say, T2A, the bacteria are going to be hit with selective pressure, namely in the form of an antibiotic. So the environment has changed because we've added antibiotic to the petri dishes, okay? And antibiotics are a poison. They usually attack the cell wall of bacteria's peptidoglandin, okay, and break the bacteria down. In other words, it'd be like you getting overcome by a toxin. Carbon monoxide is a good example. Okay, takes up all the spots that normally hemoglobin would carry oxygen and carries carbon dioxide, and you die. Okay, same sort of thing. That's what an antibiotic does to the bacteria. So now the environment has changed. We've added antibiotic right here, right? They're exposed, the microbes, the bacteria are exposed to that. What happens? Oh, it's not good. Okay, all the wild type, the white bacteria, you can see that they're all kind of fuzzy. Well, it's because they died. So, all these individuals, all these white bacteria have died. Also, the yellow one has also died, and the blue one have also gotten fuzzy and died. The only ones left over are the red ones. For some reason, now these bacteria, remember, they had mutations from previous generation. Remember the red bacteria over here. Okay, they're the ones that survived. T plus 2A. Oh, and then we'll call this 2B, to time 2B. And the only ones left over are these red mutation bacteria. They're the only ones that survived. Time T3, we now have only red have survived, and they've reproduced. And now all we have is a population of red it makes because they're resistant to the antibiotic, and none of the other ones were, which they were all killed. So they reproduce and reproduce new bacteria that have the same mutation that allows them to survive because it's been antibiotic. Okay. Now I want you to go to Canvas. So let me get out of this. I want you to go to chapter 11 on Canvas. Under Slides and Media, it says antibiotic resistance, or watch bacteria evolve. It's a short video, and it shows how bacteria evolve as an individual changes the selective environment by having different concentrations of antibiotic. Where they start off, the bacteria start off with no antibiotic, they live just fine, and you'll see what happens. It'll basically the same thing that we just went through here will show up there. Also, as you know, I expected you guys to watch the evolutionary evidence, why evolution is true. Already it's about 60 minutes, so you should also watch that. Okay. Now we're going to go on. So we've gotten that. Now go on to another. Oh, here's a question. What evolved in terms of bacteria and antibiotics? The population of bacteria evolved? Did individual bacteria evolve? Did humans evolve? Did the antibiotic evolve? Okay. In this case, remember, only populations evolve. So, only population of bacteria evolved. Question 2. What was the source of the genetic variation among the bacteria? Was it because of the environment with antibiotics? Did that change? Did that evolve? Or was it because of random mutation? Okay, so what was the source of genetic variation? What's the source of genetic variation? It's random mutation, always. The environment is not evolving. The environment is imposing selection on individuals, in this case, individual bacteria. What was the source of selection on the bacteria? Was it random mutation, or was the source of selection who lived, who died, who reproduced, the environment? Well, the environment imposed differential selection. If a bacteria had a random mutation that let it survive just by chance alone, and in the presence of antibiotics, it then survived and reproduced. And then, okay, so same sort of thing. Industrial melanism. It turns out this is kind of a natural experiment, but at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, people were burning coal, and the first machines that were used, they either used water wheels and water power, or they invented the steam engine, and they burned coal to heat up water to then run steam engine power with belts and all that to do all kinds of things, including sewing and all kinds of things, making metallic objects, all that. There's these moths. Before everybody was burning coal, the tree trunks looked mainly light colored, like here, light colored tree trunks, right? Lighter colored tree trunks, okay? And then as coal was burned, more and more coal was released into the atmosphere. It settled on all different objects, and the trees changed in color. They didn't evolve, they just got covered in soot. And so the trees from the soup. Same thing here. Now, there were two different morphs of what are called peppered moths. So these are moths. They're eaten by birds. Birds use, of course, vision to identify them. So there were two morphs, and it turns out that before coal was burned and the trees were lighter colored, so here's a light colored morph. Here's a light colored morph. Here's a light colored morph. Okay. And then we'll say a dark colored morph. You can see various ones. And then finally, dark colored morph. Okay. Dark colored morph. They stand out before the coal dust. The dark colored morph is hard to see in the coal dust, and the light colored morph is easy to see. Which ones get eaten? Well, obviously the light colored morph is now getting eaten. The dark colored morph is surviving and reproducing, and the population evolves over time so that most moths are now dark colored. There's still some variation, but not very much. It turns out many years later, in the 1970s, people stopped burning coal, used natural gas and other things that were cleaner, and the trees cleaned up, and they suddenly ended up with light colored bark. And again, the light colored morph was favored, and they became more common, and the dark colored morph became less common. Okay. So I'm going to ask some stuff about this. So what evolved? Individual moths, the environment, or the population of moths? Again, populations evolve. Okay, I'm going to ask you actually if you go to the bottom of chapter 11, you'll see what were called classroom quizzes that I was doing. So I'm going to open up one. It's going to be this one, and you're going to have to answer the question. What was the source of the genetic variation among the individual moths? Was the coal pollution the source of the genetic variation, or was it random mutation? Okay. Again, what was the source of selection on the moths? In other words, if a moth was dark or light, that depended on the genetic variation, right? But the coal dust and the covering of the trees changed the environment, right? Okay, so what was the source of selection? Was it random mutation, or was it the environment? Had the environment changed? Yes, it was the environment. And then finally, what trait of variant moths was adaptive as the trees darkened? Okay. The environment was adaptive? No. The environment just imposed selection. Was it random mutation? No. What was adaptive? Well, the dark colored morph was able to be camouflaged on dark the word, come on, coal dust covered trees, and it was hidden from view. Birds couldn't see it as well. So it had to be a dark colored morph. Okay. And then finally, some things that would falsify evolution. Fossils in the wrong place in the wrong time frame in the geological record. For example, mammals in the Devonian, there weren't even any tetrapods. In other words, four-legged vertebrates on land at that period of time. If we were to find a fossil of a mammal, and mammals have distinctive bone structure and all that, we could identify that. And we found those mammals in the Devonian, we'd say, oh, well, this completely blows up evolution. We've never found anything like that. In other words, humans and dinosaurs, modern humans arose about 300,000 years ago. Dinosaurs evolved around 200 million years ago. Okay, if we were to find fossils that were in the same layer, the same time, that would blow things out of the water. Of course, creationists often say we have evidence that humans and dinosaurs actually existed at the same time. It's a hoax. Okay. We'll learn more about this, but if there's no genetic or phenotypic variation in a population and species, they can't evolve. Adaptations would not have evolved by a step-by-step process that gradually increased function and fitness, in other words, those that survive or reproduce. If there's discordance between phylogenies based on homology, remember homology, that's similar structures with a similar evolutionary history from being inherited from a common ancestor, including DNA. So if we found things that showed no genetic similarity but were the same bones and stuff, and let's say the limbs of tetrapods, that would be in fact something that would make you question whether descent from a common ancestor was actually happening, or great genetic distance between species that apparently are much more closely related. That would falsify it as well. Okay. Go to chapter 11 and answer the quiz question. Please answer Moth question 2 on Canvas on chapter 11 at the bottom under classroom quizzes. Thanks.